Is March 23rd, 2009. We're at the Peabody Public Library. I'm Deb Lawrence, and this is Robert Brittain, and he is here to share memories with us for the Oral History of Whitley County project. So, Mr. Brittain, were you born in Whitley County?
Yes, I was born in Whitley County, and I've lived my entire life in Whitley County, except for the 3 years that I was at Indiana University as a student.
And what township did you grow up in?
Thorn Creek.
Thorn Creek? And they had their own school system at Thorn Creek?
I went to, my mother was a teacher, and I went to grades, the first couple grades in Columbia City, and then I was with her when she was at Collins, and then I had grades 5 through 8 at Thorn Creek, and then of course Columbia City Joint High School.
I like that. You put the Columbia City Joint High School in there. Most people don't remember that that was the name before they renamed it, the school. What was it like going to school in Thorn Creek?
Well, my class was the first class of the baby boom era, and the township and all the schools, of course, were busy trying to build enough space for the hordes of kids coming into schools. And I remember that my class had about 40 to 45 students in it. There was no space to divide it into two sections, so the principal relieved the classroom teacher one period a day in grades 5, 6, 7, and 8, and he taught our math class.
So the teacher could go out and
right. So the teacher would have some time to work on grades and deal with 45 kids and the records associated with 45.
Did you have clubs, activities there, or was that more in high school?
That was more in high school. Prior to the 60s, most of the elementary schools only had basketball teams, but no other activities. 4-H was very important in the summer, but other than that, very few activities.
So what was Columbia City like in the 50s?
Columbia City was a very quiet town. One thing that I really remember about Columbia City was shopping at Christmas time. There were stores lining Van Buren Street from Main Street all the way to Walnut Street, and at Christmas time it was important that we would visit all of those stores to make sure we could find the very best Christmas presents possible. And there were most stores, there were competing stores, a couple of dime stores, 2 or 3 drug stores, that kind of thing, and at least in our family, we didn't do all of our shopping in one store. We bought distilled water at the Columbia Drug, and for our gardens we always had to treat our seed potatoes with formaldehyde. So we bought formaldehyde at Stickler's Drug Store on Main Street. So we kind of spread our business around to the various stores and buying what we thought was the specialty in each store.
So there were lots more stores downtown than there are now.
Absolutely.
Can you remember some of that?
Oh, right. The kid-friendly store in town, the neatest store in town, at least from my perspective, was Roffer's Dime Store. You walked into the dime store and immediately you had the candy containers, that they were glass containers, and the clerk would scoop out the candy that you ordered and then put it in a bag. And so once you got past the candy, then you could go to the far back part of the store where they had the toy department. And Roffer's had the best toy department in town. And Mr. Roffer, the only people he didn't rush out of his store were the kids, because he kind of let the kids practice with the cars and turn the trains over and look at them. But when adults came into the store to buy scissors or sewing goods or whatnot, his goal was to wait on them quickly, find the product. Preferably he would find it rather than the shopper, get it in a bag, and encourage the adults to leave the store quickly. But the kids, we were another we were a special group. We could spend a lot of time analyzing the toys. And then, of course, in the basement, the hardware store was there. Claire Reed ran Reed's Hardware, and the big thing I remember about Claire and his wife at Christmas time especially, if kids would come in, they always made sure that when you were buying Christmas presents for mom and dad, that they were practical Christmas gifts, reasonably priced, and especially for kids, they would agree to wrap the presents personally, and they were always pretty nice when you took them out to the car.
Now, where in reference to today's Columbia City would this have been located?
Okay, the Roffer Dime Store is in what's called the Roffer Building now, at the corner of Line Street and Van Buren Street on the northeast corner. The large three or four story building.
Where the very first library was, with the big turret there.
That's correct.
Ah, okay. Any other really neat things that you
Okay,
did?
well, other stores that stood out, Montgomery Ward had a store in town where you could buy, it was a two-story store, they had furniture on the second floor and a variety of products on the first floor, or you could place your mail orders there and pick up your mail order products at the store. And they were in the Grant Building, which is on West Van Buren Street. Sears and Spiegel's both, Sears longer than Spiegel's, but they had a catalog store where they had very few items on the store, but you could go in and place your order, and in 2 or 3 days the order would be there for customers to pick up. Those were important stores. For kids, going to the West Ward and the Marshall Building, or what we call the Marshall Building now, Fisher's Filling Station was the place to be after school, because Earl had a huge selection of penny candy, and he had a couple bins of candy that he sold for 2 pieces for a penny. And so one could spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out how to best spend any spare money. And I remember that I had a cousin that usually for my birthday mailed me 10 cents and would go to Earl's after school. And it took a long time to figure out what the best buy was
for penny candy,
in the store.
Sure. 10 pieces of candy might take a while to decide
right.
which one you wanted.
Or whether you wanted to parlay them into 20 pieces by buying those
sure.
for a penny.
Sure. What about social activities in the community? Did you have like 4th of July picnics, or?
We usually went to the fireworks in town at DeVole Field. We'd sit on the hill, and the fireworks would be shot out down on what is the football field, or was the football field, on the south side of what was then US 30, and about everybody in town would come in and watch the fireworks. In the community, most of the townships had organizations called Neighborhood Extension Organizations, NEO, and usually those groups had, 10 to 20 families, and they met once a month at the school, and the kids would play in the gym, and the parents would, it was mainly a social group, but they'd also try to have projects in the community. I think our community, the guys did a lot of time cleaning up some of the cemeteries that weren't real well cared for, and I remember helping Dad and the other guys. The kids were grub workers. We could carry the limbs after brush was cut and things like that. Some of the other NEOs built parks, small 2 or 3 table roadside parks, and maintained them as a kind of a gathering place for people in the community. And the NEOs kept scrapbooks of their projects, and then those scrapbooks were displayed at the 4-H fair.
Ah, okay. So you said you lived in Thorn Creek. Did you live on a farm, or was it?
Yes, my father farmed 120 acres on the home farm, and then he also farmed a neighbor farm that had 80 acres.
So you had to help with that?
Oh yes, we were that was the day before gravity beds, so we did a lot of shoveling in the grain bins and looking after those things. My mom was a teacher, and when they had their 2 days of teacher training in Fort Wayne at the end of October, that was about the time Dad decided it was time to pick corn with his two-row corn picker on the tractor. But whenever he'd turn corners, then if he didn't get the picker shut off in time, corn would fly over the wagon, and my brother's job and my job, we were supposed to walk behind the wagon and pick up any corn that missed the wagon for some reason, and he kept us pretty busy doing that. But sometimes when the corn got high enough in the bed that he couldn't see, then Richard and I would climb into the back of the wagon and ride until we got to the corner. But we got into trouble if we got into fights and started throwing corn at one another. Then Dad could see corn flying the wrong way, and then he would stop, and we would walk for a longer period of time.
So, what else can you tell us about Columbia City in the 50s?
Well, I'll talk about my home first.
Mm-hmm.
I remember television. The first Fort Wayne television station was on the air in late 1953. Before that, people that we would call today early technology adopters bought television sets. Maybe by the 50s the screens were 15 to 20 inches maybe, but they put up big aerials to get stations from Kalamazoo and Toledo and sometimes Chicago or Indianapolis. And sometimes on Friday night, one of our neighbors that had a big aerial would call us at about 11 o'clock, and he'd say something like, why don't you guys come over? We're getting a good picture today from Toledo, and you guys can come over and we can watch TV together for a couple hours tonight. And another lady in town, Mary Walker, it would have been former mayor's mother. She was the cook at Collins, and she rode back and forth with Mom. And Mary had a huge 27-inch television set in the mid-50s, and so Mary was a very kind woman, and she'd often say, well, why don't the boys stay at my house, and Mom can go ahead and do her shopping, and so we got to watch some of those early TV shows. My father always said, well, when there's he said this in 1952, when there's a TV station in Fort Wayne, then we'll think about getting a TV in our own house. He was pretty confident that wouldn't happen in his lifetime, but 2 years later there was a TV station in Fort Wayne, and so on the first day, well, when Christmas vacation started, and I don't know what day it was, but whatever day it was, Phil Lemon from Lemon's RCA was there about 10 minutes after we got home from school for Christmas break, and he was there busy installing the TV set and getting an aerial set up so we could get a good picture from the Fort Wayne television set. So, and the first TV show that we watched, this sounds funny today, but the first TV show we watched, and I still remember, was Pinky Lee at 4 o'clock, followed by Howdy Doody at about 4:30. So that was a big move.
And you weren't going to let him forget that.
That's right.
Okay. Just whatever other memories that you have. This is wonderful.
Okay. Automobiles, of course, I remember, especially after we were in high school and in town, in the early 60s when all of the car dealers were within walking distance from the high school. One of the big things, especially for freshmen and some sophomores who didn't have driver's licenses, in late September or early October when the new cars would come out, we, as groups of 2 or 3 people, go to Thompson's and Schrader's and Thomas Ford's and Reed's Pontiac and kick the tires of the new cars and pick up literature and take them home and try to convince parents that it was time to trade their ancient cars for new cars. And that was a big thing, and it was always an exciting thing to do after school when the new models were out in the fall. things like that.
So there were several more car dealers in town
Right.
than there are now.
Right.
All right. So then, after Thorn Creek, you got to go to the high school.
Yes.
What kind of good stuff did you do there?
Okay, well, first of all, moving from the older building at Thorn Creek, that in the late 50s, people still didn't insulate buildings very well because heat was relatively cheap. And in the wintertime, in the west classrooms that had full exposure to the west wind, in the winter, those rooms were cold, they were dark, and the lights weren't fluorescent, so it didn't seem like a very modern building. And at Thorn Creek, we also were fortunate enough to have some library service from the Peabody Library, and about every month the books were changed in the Thorn Creek Library, and so you always try to eye those and find the 2 or 3 that were the best and get them checked out before anybody else did. But when we got to high school, in 1961, 1960, the fall of 1960, we finally were in a beautiful, new, modern school. The rooms were fully lighted because the walls, one wall was all glass, and so we could get a lot of natural light in the building, and the paint was, each room or every other room had a different color, and it was a lot brighter than the beige, poorly lighted classrooms in Thorn Creek. And of course, in 1960-61, the first housing development there on the north side of the high school, Collinwood Acres, that housing development was going up, and the revolutionary prefab homes were being built in that first row next to the high school. And for some reason, watching the trucks come in the morning and bringing in walls and putting them up with cranes and putting a house together in less than a day was far more interesting than listening to the dull teachers talking about math and doing homework. It was a lot better to watch those new houses go up, and it was amazing to see how quickly they went up. But just being in a new building that was, at least at then we thought it was up to date and different. The library was terribly spacious compared with what we were used to, even probably a little bit more elbow room than even the public library downtown. But of course they had moved lots of books into the library from the old Columbia City High School on Walnut Street. And back then the circulation cards, you wrote your name on the circulation card and the librarian kept it. And so one of the first things that a lot of freshmen would do, that we'd look for the older books and see who had checked them out, to see whether or not we could find out whether our parents were guilty of reading any of those books. And when we had, the other thing that the sign-out form did was, if we wanted to know whether a book was really worth reading or not, we'd see who had checked it out. And if the right people had read the book, the right older people had read the book that we knew and thought they were fairly smart, then it was a good deal. It was all right to check out the book. But if it had a card in it that no one had filled out, it was pretty dangerous to check out that book, because it really wasn't a very
Untested
good book.
territory.
Right. Of course, freshmen had only one study period a week, and that was the activity period. And they wanted to make sure that we didn't waste any of our time in study hall. So we had 5 classes a day, every day, until the last period of the day on Friday, which was called a diagonal, and then that was a study hall. Later on, they changed the diagonal. They changed the study hall, so the last period of the day was a class and not a study hall, because the school population kind of dwindled a little bit with a study hall at the end of the day, and Mr. Gandy had to be a little bit more aggressive about finding kids who were supposed to be in school.
Oh, they would
and he found a lot of them, but that kind of thing. Lunch was interesting. When I was a freshman, we had one lunch period, and if you weren't among the first people to reach the cafeteria, even though the lunch was 70 minutes long, you might spend half of that in line waiting to be fed.
Oh, one lunch period for the whole school?
Right.
Wow.
I have no idea why they did that. If I were going to guess, it was because before we moved into the joint high school, the city kids went home, and the elementary cafeterias only had to feed 200 or 300 people and not 1,000. So it probably took a while to figure out that you needed to have staggered lunches, and so that's what they did then. After that first year, we had staggered lunch periods and only 30 minutes to eat, but we didn't spend as much time in line. Mildred Ferguson was the head cook, and she was concerned that her kids, and every kid at Cocoa City Joint High School, was one of hers. She made sure that we had plenty to eat. She had a big seconds table, and she'd go around to the grocery stores. Her husband had been involved in groceries anyway, so she knew where to look for bargains, and so she'd stop by Kroger's and the other stores, and if they had bananas or fruit that was very edible but was nearing the end of its useful life, they'd sell them to Mildred at a reduced price, and then she could put them on the seconds table for the kids, and we were always glad to eat from her seconds table because it was a pretty good choice of fruits and maybe a few leftover cookies and things like that.
Very cool. So, explain to us, when you moved into that high school, it was new.
The first year for the high school was 1958. Columbus City Joint High School, the first year they moved into the new building would have been in, I think, October of 1958. So they had the school put together by the fall of 1960 when I started, and a couple of classes, a couple of trial runs. So they everything was built and ready to go. And as I understand it, when they first moved into the building, some of the furniture that needed to be put together wasn't put together, and they brought the legs and the parts, and some of the shop kids and other kids who had extra time finished the final assembly work on some of the cafeteria tables and some of the library tables and things like that to get everything up and going.
So, and I'm assuming they have built on to that
Right.
school since then.
Yeah, we've added several additions. The major addition was added in 1969, which we still call the new part, to the school. When by 1960 we had about 1,050 kids in the building, and it was supposedly designed for 900, and we added the major addition in 69, and then we've at several points added a few rooms here and did quite a bit of remodeling, expanded the library area to its current size.
Has the library always been situated
Right.
where it is now?
The school library has always been in the west, on the lower level of the main building, on the west side.
Okay. At least I got plenty of time. Let's see what else we have. Any buildings or stores that were in effect when you were growing up that aren't here now that you can remember? Yeah, I know that could take the whole rest of the tape. But
Well, the major difference between the 50s and 60s and 2009 would be that 50 years ago, most of the businesses were local, and they were owned by local people. And we had the major chain store in town was Schultz's Dime Store, which is where Ball Furniture is right now. But other than that, most of the Kroger chain store has been in town for a long time. But other than that, most of the drugstores and most of the furniture stores, the filling stations, were all owned by local people, and they weren't parts of chains. We always thought that if you could park within a couple blocks of the store, that was pretty good. if we were really lucky, we found a parking place in front of the store. But lots of times when we go out to Walmart today, we walk a lot further than we did, even though we had to park a block away from the store. I remember Mosier's Barber Shop in the 60s. Mosier's Barber Shop in the 50s and 60s was on East Van Buren Street, right next to where the Star Bank is now. It was next to the theater then. It was a small room. Bob had about 3 barbers there on Saturday, but everybody that needed his haircut on Saturday would come in at about 8:30. So that meant that there was quite a bit of time to wait to get your hair cut. And of course, the only legal gambling in Columbia City was whether or not you put a penny in the parking meter. And so the obvious thing to do would be to see how long you could park on the streets without feeding the meter. And so that some of the guys had 2 strategies. One strategy was to put a penny in the meter and turn the knob and have 12 minutes of parking, and then put a second penny in the meter, because the meter patrol person would always turn the knob before he'd write a ticket. And he never figured out that he shouldn't turn the knob, but he'd do that perpetually. He'd be ready to write a ticket, turn the knob, he wouldn't be able to write his ticket. The more aggressive guys at the shop would keep an eye out on, and he always walked the same way. And he had everybody knew about when he'd be around. And so as soon as, and he was called Oliver, as soon as they saw Oliver within a block, most of the guys in the barber shop would clear out, and whoever was in the chair would give a penny to somebody, and they would wait until Oliver was just ready to write a ticket, and then they'd put a penny in the meter, and they would win gambling. So that was kind of a sport on Saturday morning, in addition to talking about whatever sports issue was big time during that week.
And it was right next door to the theater.
Correct.
We had a theater uptown then.
Correct.
And what kind of, did they have matinees? And,
Oh yes. On weekends they had matinees. For kids, on weekends, kids could get in for a quarter. And I remember, I don't know how often we went, we would go occasionally, but Walt Disney movies. Davy Crockett was a real big movie in the 1950s. And when it first hit the Columbia Theater, everybody had to see it on the first day. And the first show was, I think, at like 6:30, and there was a line to get into the theater, and the end of the line was back almost to well, it was on the south side of the library. People were lined up from Chauncey Street up to, or not Chauncey, Jackson Street up to the show to get in and see it. And of course, you always bought popcorn, and it was a nice theater, a big screen, and fairly comfortable seats. Not as comfortable as the rocking chairs at Bones, but it was a comfortable theater, air conditioned, and in the 50s, lots of people would show up for the first run movies. After theaters were built in Fort Wayne, then small town theaters had more difficulty getting first run pictures, and so when we had a dual highway and it was a little bit quicker to get to Fort Wayne, then attendance started dropping radically in town, especially because the movies were old.
Mm. Speaking of that dual highway,
yes,
what kind of a difference has that made?
when the experienced people in town said, when we move 30 out of downtown Columbia City, the city will die. And of course, 30 was moved, and then of course the city didn't die. Several filling stations are now no longer filling stations, but used for other activities. And it took a while for filling stations to migrate from Chicago Street on the south side of town to North Main Street out by US 30. But downtown is I'd hate to think of what downtown would be like if we had the traffic going down Van Buren Street that we have on US 30. It would be impossible. So it made it possible for downtown to be a lot quieter and friendly to pedestrians and people who wanted to shop downtown for the stores that are there.
Okay, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the school system since you got just a little bit of knowledge of that. So I will just turn it over to you.
Okay. School's always been fascinating. Primarily my mom was a teacher, and I don't know at what tender age I decided I wanted to teach, but anyway, I've been involved with schools most of my life, or all of my life. I remember when I was at Collins, wooden floors with desks that were nailed to the floor so the janitor could clean the building a lot easier. I remember at Thorn Creek we had tables and chairs, and it made it more difficult to clean, but a whole lot more comfortable for kids. I remember what it was like to function in classrooms that weren't air conditioned, and I remember how great it felt when we finally got our classrooms air conditioned at Columbia City High School. In 1969, when we added a new building, the new part was fully air conditioned, and the original building wasn't. And so there were some hot days. Those of us who taught in the original building were somewhat cranky when we ran into our colleagues who were in the new part who complained about the building being too cold.
Oh.
And so that was a difficult thing. The revolution from in the 60s, one of the things that teachers worried about was the transistor radio being smuggled into the classroom. Suddenly, it became stylish for everybody to wear bulky knit sweaters because bulky knit sweaters would conceal a transistor radio, and it would also conceal the earpiece that you could run up your arm to your ear and listen to the World Series or whatever was going on.
The Beatles.
The Beatles and the music and whatnot. But obviously, being the son of a teacher, I was never guilty of doing anything that was that huge of an atrocity. But I think probably the teachers were about as upset with transistor radios in 1962 as they are with cell phones in 2009. The only difference was, I think, when teachers confiscated transistor radios, they didn't have to worry about making sure that the key parts were missing. Today, when we take cell phones, we have to make sure that the SIM cards are still there, so the kid can't just install his SIM card in a new phone and forget about the punishment. Some of the experienced teachers, when I started teaching, of course, were concerned about the horrors of eating or chewing gum in class, and that seems to be a minor concern now. We've always had concerns about dress codes, whether it was bulky knit sweaters that hid transistor radios or caps that hid faces so we couldn't see who was guilty of talking or harboring a cell phone or some other electronic device that shouldn't be involved in school. Electronics, I remember in 1957, this was before I started teaching, Sputnik created a major concern in education in the United States. If Russians could launch a space satellite and we couldn't, that meant that our science programs were terribly inadequate. And so in Indiana, Sputnik was launched in 1957 in the fall, and by the spring of 1957, we had hastily adopted science books, and we had portable labs that people could roll from room to room. And I still remember feeling so sorry for some of the women who were teaching in middle school, junior high then, or 8th grade. They were great teachers, but they really had very little experience dealing with beakers and test tubes and hammers and nails and whatnot. And so some of the more talented mechanical kids spent time helping the teachers teach science and using the paraphernalia that was needed. So we reacted quickly there. I remember when I first started teaching, we were using film projectors, and they were difficult to thread. The new ones were self-threading, and that was cool, but the AV director liked to tease me, so he always gave me one that needed to be fed manually. And the only reason I ever learned how to feed the manual old projector was because 2 or 3 students taught me how to do it, and I figured if they could do it, I should be able to do it. I remember when we adopted computers in the classrooms or in schools back in the early 80s. Apple IIe Plus was the cutting edge technology. If you had a word processing program, it was on a disk, and you inserted the disk and loaded the word processing program before you started using the word processing program.
And how big were these computers?
Well, they were not quite as small as what we have today, but they took up some space. I remember when we did that, I was the advisor for the school newspaper, and a kid convinced me that we should use computers. He said, if I can show you a word processing program, will you let me be the technology manager for the school newspaper? And I said yes, figuring that there was no way he would convince me that that would work, but it only took him 2 minutes to load the program and justify a line mechanically, and I said, yes, you can be the editor if you want to be. And so I don't know, we had 5 or 6 computers in the building, and when we did the newspaper, we hauled the attendance office's computer and printer upstairs and plugged it in and printed, and then we taped and got the newspaper together. But without kids telling teachers, helping teachers learn cutting edge technology and knowing what buttons to push to get us to adopt to that technology, they were some of our most valuable sources. We laugh now about those computers, and I don't know how many times in helping kids I killed all of the work they had done for an hour and a half. But nobody hit me because I killed their work, and we survived. But the big lesson was save and save often, and I think that's probably still one of the major lessons. But when technology happens, it happens quickly, and teachers who are willing to learn, especially not too proud to learn from their kids, then technology is a very happy thing. And of course today, when you push buttons and insert grades quickly, and when you can load a term paper into a computer and have it checked for plagiarism in a couple minutes, that's something that I never was able to do. In terms of mechanically, we had to always in the back of our mind as we read the paper, okay, now is this really the student's work, or does this sound too much like somebody else? And so that was good. I think another area that technology has been absolutely fantastic is in the debate world. That involves a lot of research. When I was a debater in high school, we thought we were cutting edge because my debate partner and I bought together a public library card for the Fort Wayne Allen County Public Library, and we thought we were really cutting edge debaters. And I remember when we first started coaching in the early 70s, we always arranged for a couple days of field trips to IU Bloomington to go through and photocopy current cutting-edge magazine articles and finding books and researching there. And now, in 2009, if we have access to computers that work consistently, and they do, we can find about anything we need to prove about any source or to check about any source on the globe in a few minutes without leaving town. And so it's only been in the last few years that I've really felt that my students were armed with the best evidence and didn't have to worry about the kids who lived in Lafayette next to the Purdue Library and that kind of thing. So that's been a huge, huge help in debate, and it's also been a fantastic help in all of education, just putting the world at the students' fingertips without leaving Columbia City. And then, of course, moving from the Peabody Library on Main Street to our new facility on 205, that's been a huge, huge help in terms of accessing the library. I'll admit that in 1963, when the library downtown was carpeted, I was kind of like, it was like an Oklahoma moment. I thought that Columbia City had gone just about as far as it could go with air conditioning and carpeting in our library. And so much for the knowledge of a high school junior. It's probably the lesson that we need to know about schools. Technology is critical, and it makes a huge, huge difference in the capacity that the teachers have to deliver education and the capacity that young people have to grab the very most current issues. Getting the New York Times online a few hours after it's printed is fantastic. I used to think that if we could get it the same day, that was really cutting edge, but we're truly at a world where information is at our fingertips, and it certainly makes life as a debate coach a lot easier.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. Any closing thoughts about the way we were?
Okay. Well, in 1969, when I started teaching, there were no filling stations that were open after 8 or 9 o'clock at night. There were no cash machines where you could get money out of your checking account. And Columbia City was a pretty quiet place on weekends, and I always had to make sure that all of the gas tanks were filled before we left town early, because I knew none of the stations would be open until the truck stop arrived a few years later. And it's been a fantastic experience to see how the community has grown, and so many of the services that we take for granted just weren't here. We thought we were a revolutionary community when we went to fully self-dialing telephones instead of the number please system. And if there's one thing that I hope that we've taught kids over the years, is that we have to keep alert and aware of the possibilities of change and the possibilities of using technology that falls into our laps. And it seems like teachers, at least in the past, I won't talk about people who are teaching today, it seems like we always worry about how bad technology will be. We worried about it, like I said before, the transistor radio. We worried about if we got computers in our classrooms, the key thing we'd have to do is make sure the kids aren't playing games on the computers. And we always worry about possible misuse instead of the opportunities. Today, there's no need to police kids because they're going to play games. They don't have long enough to play them, so they have to do that after school. The hope of technology generally is better than the negatives, although it's important that proper use is always there, but what we fear often is the last thing that will really happen.
Very good. All right, well, if you don't have anything else, we'll thank you very much.
Okay.
And we're always open to more suggestions. If you decide you want to do this again, we'd be more than happy.
Okay, maybe a couple words about the library
sure.
when we wrap up. I said earlier about how I thought advanced we were in 1963, and our new facility, I just feel so proud of what our community is doing whenever I see fathers and mothers and young people coming into the public library and going through the books and checking out books for their kids and using the facilities, because I know that my mother always was very careful to make sure that we got to the library several times a month to check out books, and for the son, the daughter, to check out the book. That it's not something that's done by the parent for the kid. The kid checks the book, goes to the shelf, uses the card catalog if we're looking for something like that, and it's just so exciting to see the difference that keeping a library facility up to date and convenient is in the lives of people. I know that without that library experience, without all the landmark books that I read when I was in 8th grade and early high school, they opened the world to me, and I am positive that with young people getting into books and in libraries that are inviting and exciting places, that will be good for education for all of us.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.